that requires fulfillment of services. And these are done to some extent by companies, but there's a quasi-state-like apparatus that could be or maybe needs to be built to service the actual needs of society. So to some extent, you could look at healthcare. Right now, healthcare exists in the private sphere or it exists in the public sphere. You could look at storage of identity or the concept of identity. Identity is issued primarily legally by a government, but you also have many private identities that are existing on the internet, whether it's a Facebook profile or any of these things. In the middle is a kind of identity that would perhaps get you some rights and privileges that are typically associated with the state, but which are actually issued by maybe a collective, a decentralized institution, or even a company. And then another example would be insurance. Typically insurance is happening in the private sector, but as we move into the future and risk changes, especially cybersecurity risk, the idea of cyber risk against you as a person or your digital identity or your digital assets has now become one of the single biggest drivers of change within the insurance industry. But the insurance industry doesn't quite know how to price for that because there are no models for this across society. So the question of this panel and this discussion, which is really a group discussion, is really what is a virtual state? What could a virtual state look like? And how do we build the infrastructure for that? And if you haven't heard of the idea of a virtual state before, it's not unusual because it's not something that has been talked about until really very recently. As far as we know, there are only maybe 4 or 5 organizations in the world that are actively working on the idea of creating infrastructure for a virtual state. We are one of them, and I'll explain some of the things that we're doing in a minute around that. But just to give you some context of where this very early seed is arriving, and what it could look like, say, over the next 10 years, would be to look at some other examples of what other people are doing. So the first example that I'd like to point out is Seasteading, the Seasteading Institute, which was an idea that was initially funded by Peter Thiel, kind of the Silicon Valley utopians, and to some extent the libertarian sort of culture of Silicon Valley, where they were looking at creating seasteading communities on the oceans that were outside of traditional national jurisdictions. And that was an idea that was kind of pie in the sky, maybe 5 years ago. But today, in Tahiti, they're building the first seasteading location, which are going to be floating locations that are moving off of the kind of infrastructure of Tahiti as a government, but with their own rules and regulations and some level of autonomy. The second thing that I would like to point to would be the really fast rising emergence of special economic zones around the world. In Saudi Arabia, they've announced 3 major initiatives for special economic zones that are focused on the environment, with the Red Sea Project, on technology, and on the future and entertainment. So this entertainment city, this environmental city, and this technical city are going to house many, many people over the next, say, 10 to 15 years. And around the world, some countries are actually looking at creating some levels of autonomy against these economic zones. Honduras is doing it in Roritan, where different groups are coming in and creating communities or intentional communities that have this level of additional service. So again, it's somewhere between a nation state and a company doing these things. Another example is Summit Series. The Summit Series is out of North America, and they have a project called Powder Mountain, where they bought a mountain and they built essentially a ski resort, but with property and with a whole bunch of different things around it. And they've had such an outsized impact on the area around it that they're actually having an impact on policy and everything else around it. The next example is Burning Man, which is a very interesting city that arrives in the desert in Nevada every year. And what's interesting about Burning Man is that it lasts for only a few days, but it has really developed over the last few years its own culture and its own autonomy around many areas of society's impact on the individual. So there are cultural norms and other activities that are happening that emanate from the Burning Man organization, but were also adopted and managed by the community. So they have their own driving regulations. They have a whole range of regulations around the layout of the city, and they have many other things that are actually moving into this idea of intentional communities. And I think a lot of where we're going with this is this merger or this blurring of the line between intentional communities, or in some cases, intentional cities. You could call the Saudi projects to be actually intentional cities with a kind of grand mission in mind, and the needs of the citizen. So the final example is Bermuda, where we're headquartered. This country, which has 60,000 members, about the same number of members that Hub Culture has, 60,000. We're a virtual community, they're a physical community. We're both about the same size. But we're working with them to think about how you can use the nation-state apparatus to be able to deliver global technology services for a virtual citizenship. So that could include perhaps recognition of identity. It could include the storage of digital vaults or asset vaults, and it can also include different forms of work or wealth creation that come from these virtual worlds that we're about to enter. And that doesn't even really cover the emerging fully virtual world that's coming very, very soon as a result of virtual reality and augmented reality in the internet. And 3 to 4 years from now, not only will we be living part of the time in virtual environments, if any of you have children, you know that they're spending a lot of time in Fortnite. But these virtual environments are going to start to move into the real world via augmented reality. We're going to start to have a combination of what Bernd Luckert from SAP this morning described as cyber-physical. I love this idea of Davos words, right? This is a Davos word. Cyber-physical. A space that exists both in augmented or virtual reality and in physical reality. This building is a little bit of that. The building has been communicating with Davos this week. And we're doing it through light and through algorithmic programs for light that are attached to this ice house in the evenings. And so when we're doing transition here, the building is communicating. When we're in conversation, the building is communicating. And when we're at rest, the building is communicating. There are 3 kind of messages that emanate from the ice house. And this is just a very early example of how the space around us will start to become augmented through virtual environments. So this is meant to be really a conversation about this kind of question, what is the virtual state? We're going to be taking notes and writing this up afterwards. And then of course we have the live stream here. If any of you are watching and you want to put in a question or a comment, we'll try to access it and bring it into the conversation here. So does anybody want to kick off with your ideas and thoughts about where this subject is going?
I do.
Okay, James Hanusa, very much a Silicon Valley thought leader, I would say. Welcome. First time in Davos.
First time in Davos.
Yeah.
So, Stan and I we met originally 10 years ago at the UN Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen, and have been traveling along the same path, and I think share a lot of the vision around kind of where things are going. My exploration of virtual states started in 2016. I went to speak in Sweden at the Swedish Political Week, and then got invited to speak at the Flow Festival in Helsinki, Finland, and took a side trip down to the Baltics and met with the CTO of Estonia, and asked him the question at dinner with his wife that night, I want to start a new country, how do I do it? And he walked me through for the next 5 hours, first 3 of really why they built that leading digital infrastructure for Estonia, and the e-residency program and everything else, the cards from birth to death for all your services and all the other great things that they've done there. And a lot of that had to do with politics, but I think the biggest takeaway that I got from that, Russia had just recently invaded the Crimea at that point, and all of the Nordic nations and the Baltic nations were a little bit nervous. And he explained that even if they were invaded, that their citizens could flee land but still remain a nation with the infrastructure that they built. So that was a key takeaway for me. And I've been kind of hacking on, what it would take to really provide the services globally. I went to Thunderbird, which is part of Arizona State University, and that was just drilled into that we are global citizens. That school was founded on the concept by returning Air Force pilots after World War II that said the only way we're going to avoid a third world war is if we have understanding between people and commerce relations between countries. Yeah, I think it's an idea that's time has come. If you look at where the polls and surveys are with especially millennials and below, they consider themselves global citizens already. There's no convincing. It's kind of like, I think this is the way that people are feeling as we go more digital, that the artificial barriers of borders are becoming less real to people.
But the barriers aren't artificial, right? You have borders, you have passports, you have militaries. You know, the idea, we've been talking a lot with people. We've been talking a lot with people about this idea because very traditional people look at it as being, I think especially older people, think of it as being totally impossible. But I think very young people see it as totally inevitable. And so there is this kind of transition that is definitely happening between the two. And if you read, you know, like Neil Stephenson and some of the science fiction writers who've been, you know, pretty prescient about some of the things that have actually happened, they would probably err towards the bottom side, that there will be a kind of, you know, blurring of the lines about these things. But, you know, we've seen right now that borders are very real, and, you know, they make a big difference.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you're completely right. And you made me think of just probably the last point, because I definitely want to hear from others. That maybe it's the digital world where those borders don't have the same, I don't know what to say, but the hard lines that we have. We just inked a strategic partnership with a platform called Versus.io just Sunday, which it is a XR, so VR and AR platform that has a virtual commerce engine, so you can do all types of crypto and crypto to fiat swaps and purchases of digital and real assets in the world. You can do all kinds of, what are you guys doing with the art? The fractional ownership of things. It's based in blockchain, obviously, built by a PhD from Cal Berkeley. And our first focus is on, pointing what you said, Stan, using this for smart city applications. So within smart contracts, you can use or control airspace of where drones can fly for delivery, for example, or the way autonomous cars move throughout a city. So we're planning to roll that out in Reno as a project the week after Burning Man this year, on an as yet named festival. But I ran new initiatives for Burning Man for 5 years. It's definitely influenced the way that we look at cities, and rolled a lot of that thinking into an agency called Urban Innovation Exchange, and did our first demonstration project for about 3 years with the city of San Leandro, California, with a new development paradigm that included citizen participation, advanced technology deployment. In that case, it was the fastest broadband in the country, and we partnered with the first woman's chief innovation officer for a city in the country, third in the US, and yeah.
I think we want to bring this conversation to the group. So, you know, I think the question I would have, you know, you could think about opportunities and obstacles, and, you know, all the stuff that you're talking about, that, are you guys thinking about these being components or ingredients to this kind of evolution in terms of the human relationship to the state, or is it about something else? Just real quick, so
Yeah.
we're
Well, I guess in this audience too, it's important to us to talk about this being SDG smart cities, with art being important within that development too, because I think a lot of the demonstrations that have happened in the world for smart cities, nobody wants to live in them because there's not culture there. So I think that's a really important part. But we want to create a sandbox where people can see what works, and hopefully there'll be a bunch of people that are contributing and looking at it. But we want to also extend the perception of possible, and give people the inspiration, and at least wrap their minds around, like, these things are coming in. We need to create solutions that address the speed of technology change and environmental change, and we feel like doing a demonstration project can do that.
So this is about a demonstration project. Okay, any other thoughts in the back? What's your name?
Hey, I'm Elizabeth. Hey, James, we've seen each other on Facebook. Good to have you. So I'm just gonna kind of spew out a few sort of questions, kind of. So I come from the Creative Media Industries Institute at Georgia State University. We have volumetric capture and all of this virtual world creation tools. But my question is, who's going to get paid to build the virtual world? And I'm a little nervous when I see things like what Amazon's doing with Sumerian and Lumberyard, and they're creating everything. And so there's that. So that's the obstacle so I'm always worried about how is creative labor going to get paid? And I love the idea of blockchain, and I've got this concept in my head, like the smart pixel that travels around and carries stuff with it. But I just was wondering. I know you guys probably have thought about these kinds of things.
Yeah, and James, is anybody else working in? I would say digital currency is going to be the answer. There's no question. That's established. It's done. Whether it's a Fortnite type currency or a blockchain currency like Bitcoin, there's absolutely no question that it won't be traditional fiat. But I think the key is the economic model, right? And so who gets paid and who gets paid to generate the work. Gino, you're working a lot in blockchain.
Well, an even more radical model related to the virtual is what if anything that affects the mind were free? Then the people that are creating things aren't creating things to subjugate other people. And so the whole neat thing about digital technology is it enables that, right? So the model is probably going to be destroyed, but a lot of models are being destroyed right now. There's no more Tower Records, for example. And so really, why are people creating what they're creating, right? And so if we can get back to the pure form of, in the early days, it was the people painting the paintings in the caves, and the people that were doing the music or telling the stories around the fire. Can we get back to that and have people gradually find their own voices?
So I mean,
like popcorn.
But that keeps happening. But somebody always seems to be able to capitalize on it.
Yeah, and we've seen that there's been this enormous centralization of power and wealth with the first stage of the internet economy, say the last 20 years, right? With these massive things. But one of the kind of great hopes of blockchain, I think, is that it will distribute this back the other way, so that you have a much longer tail of ways to create money. And we've certainly seen in the early era of blockchain, the best wealth creation for young people in ever, really, but certainly within a generation. The first time, really since millennials have hit the workforce, that a young person could actually find a way to generate income in a novel way, in a way that's really connected to the internet. However, we've also seen centralization. So I think there becomes a really interesting question about whether or not in capitalistic systems, you actually, in fact, the more capitalistic it is, perhaps the more inevitable it is that you end up with extremely large centralization. And the reason is that if you just think of it from a mathematical standpoint, if we say that we're a democracy right here, and every one of us is given the exact same access to resources and information and, say, money, and we're going to go work, well, pretty soon this is going to start to vary, and a few of us will make bad decisions, or a few will make good decisions, and this will amplify and amplify and amplify. And in tech, this actually happens very, very quickly, and with AI, it happens not just vertically, but horizontally. So this is why, there's an AI element to all of this discussion, because in the AI world, you're going to start to see AI cutting horizontally across industries, and again, being potentially very winner take all. Blockchain, I think, is the only thing that's a potential counterbalance to that, but the problem is that even that has found enormous centralization very quickly. Like if you look at Bitcoin, there are really 12 companies that control Bitcoin, right? They just mostly happen to be in China, and they're miners. So the centralization didn't occur on the side that people expected that it would. It's happened with Ethereum too. But there is centralization of power and a choke point that can control these networks. So the big question, I think, is whether or not centralization of power is inevitable based on activity and time. And then that actually points a case for regulation, because what regulation does is it tries to break up, I mean, ideally, perhaps good regulation, tries to break up those monopolistic tendencies that have grown too large to provide a playing field for other people, or technical innovation. But then again, the technical cycle of innovation may be too slow. So like what we're seeing right now with China is very interesting, because China has figured out that AI is pretty much what matters, and that's a generational play. And by the time that generational play, along with the other generational play about access to resources, which is effectively Africa and Central Asia, they figured that out and they've got it. And that's a generational play. And by the time that cycle, which is extremely long and large, plays out, it's likely to be too late for everything else. Unless there's an unexpected, black swan event or some technological change that makes those things irrelevant, which could potentially happen. Other thoughts?
Mr. Ellen, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Yes. Sorry. Hi. Hi. There's the last question or comment was related to work who's going to build. So what I didn't hear was a response to short, medium, and long. So in my mind, short is going to be traditional fiat guerrilla companies coming in and trying to dominate like we're trying to do with blockchain and crypto right now. Whether they will or not, that's for people like me, I don't think they will, but for short term, the short term, what is that? That's the next 5 to 10 years. That's the term of what's going to happen. That's what we're all living in, right? After that, I think then the models would start to permeate the reverse, which is creators getting paid and compensated for what they create, and our data all of us being compensated for our data, as opposed to making billions of dollars for Google or Facebook or whatever else. So, in my opinion, that's about 10 years out before the models really start to stick. So that's really my direct response to it. And then long term, we'll see where, if the planet makes it, we'll figure out that. That's the way I feel.
We've got 2 of the 16 members of WEF's Future of Computing Council here too, and I wondered if you guys might have any insights from what you've heard or would like to share.
Yeah, well, my name is Yuri from Geest. Thank you, James. My input would be a little bit abstract, but perhaps fundamental. I see a shift away from digital to analog systems. So this has been going on for quite a few years in China, this insight, but now it's also in the US. It has been posted by George Dyson January 1st on the website called edge.org. So my point is, based on that amazing post, highly recommended. It's called Childhood's End, based on a science fiction novel in the past. So my point is, we can talk about virtual nations and blockchain, smart contracts and AI and quantum AI, but I think it's also important to counterbalance that with analog systems, living technologies, quantum, light-based technologies, photonics, and also human input to balance out digitization. Because digital extracts, it's about scarcity in a way, while analogs creates abundance and wisdom. And it sounds counterintuitive, I understand, but it makes a lot of sense, so keep that in mind.
Futurist Benjamin Butler.
I'm still gathering my thoughts, but one thing that concerns me regarding, you said in digital there was no divides. One thing that was very much a conversation in Dubai at WEF was the China-US divide and whether we're going to be forced into one of those systems. And Eric Schmidt was talking about that in his last book. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts.
I don't. I just like being in this conversation to think about all the challenges that come up and all the great questions that might be raising. Is there a couple others?
Yeah, and I think we want to make this really a group conversation. And I think if we think about outcomes, we have about another 30 minutes. But I would love it if we could get to a definition of this, because this has been something that's been kind of in the ether, but I think it's one of those things that is going to very soon become real. And a great example of this is digital identity. 4 years ago, 5 years ago, no one could really even get their head around the idea of digital identity and how important it would become and how important it would be for it to be individually owned. But some conversations like this with key people set the kind of collective wisdom around it, which really had a huge impact on how that developed, where now there was a set of principles that were later developed that really now there's like a very clear view of like what a good digital identity pathway looks like for the future. And this is sort of the reason I wanted to put this conversation together with all of you today, is just these are seeds that are going to start to go out as you start to think about these things. And if we have some kind of idea of collective definition of what this might start to look like, first of all, it's going to make it much more real in the kind of energetic field. But secondly, it'll allow us to kind of be a little bit synchronized as we start to think about the risks and dangers and opportunities associated with this. This idea of a two-tiered or two internets, I think, is actually even larger in the sense that there's a danger or a possibility of complete fragmentation of internets in the very near future, especially when you look at mobile technology and mobile meshes, satellite, some of these things. But there was some stuff that happened this morning that really made me even think bigger. It's like, have you guys ever thought about, like, what if there was a complete alternative to digital? Like, the evolution of everything has been towards this internet and digital, and pretty much our whole life has been dominated by it. But I shocked you when you just said maybe there's a return to analog. But what if there's an entirely different technology that isn't digital and isn't analog and is as yet unimagined, that is, think about how central digital is to the entire economy right now, and I almost can't imagine it not being there. It's almost like water or air. But what if there's another technology that's out there that could be thought of that actually completely changes the whole paradigm? That was one of my thoughts this morning.
Just one comment. In Asia, consciousness is actually considered a technology.
That's fascinating. Can we hear from the ladies?
So, I mean, are you referring to us ladies here?
Yes.
I mean, hi. I'm afraid I come from the boring old stuff. My PhD is in neuroscience, so it's the squishy stuff. Maybe that'll have a return, as you were mentioning here. I'm more here to learn about more the other side and what could be some of the disrupting factors, and where an area like my area might still fit.
It might be the
Let's hope.
There's a whole group of people in this room that probably think it's the only thing that matters, but that's another conversation, perhaps.
So I think brain-computer interface, when we get to there, that's going to be maybe one of the biggest revolutions since man started walking upright. When we get into being able to control our cognitive capacity and our emotional states and everything else, and you're a neuroscientist, so you can tell me better than I can tell you, but I think that technology is coming. You can look at kernel and Neuralink that Elon's been working on, and I think it's actually a very, very interesting wing of technology development right now.
Yeah,
Have you guys heard the term Lucan sapien?
Yeah, so I mean, I've done some work with them, but aside from that, because it's a little bit confidential, what I think is interesting is that in the area of commerce, we're already seeing a lot of neuroscience, so I'm at the crossroads of biology and finance. So after I finished, I started working in banking, in the capital markets. And there are all types of wild things being developed because we understand how the brain works. So, for example, people are addicted to cigarettes not because of the tobacco, but because of the experience. How does a paper crackle? What is the ambient scene, etc. And you can take those same learnings and put them into the stock market and into trading and to predicting how to behave in certain markets. And when you find out how that works, then it's druggable. So when you go into the pharmaceutical area, there are definitely disruptions we're seeing there in pharma and in finance. But as far as what you guys are talking about, the hard technological stuff, this is where I'm kind of blank
I want to build this, so some new insights. So we move let's say from a high level point of view, mechanistic technologies, we move to living technologies. Living. That's a big meme emerging. China is really advanced there as well. So to make it practical, for example, your DNA is a packet of light or photons, not just chemistry at a lower level. So that means we consist of light, biophotons, and quantum biology. But more importantly, to your domain, the DNA creates the disposition and structure of the brain to a large degree, 50 to 60%, as you probably know better than me. That means the brain is quantum light-based to a certain degree. It's computational. So Neuralink, Elon Musk, Daniel Dennett, Ray Kurzweil. I've been doing that for Singularity University the last 9 years, right? It's true, but it's not the whole story, because the brain or consciousness is also bodily, and also it's quantum light-based, including connected to the universe, we have recently discovered scientifically. So consciousness is not just the brain, it's also connected to the universe, even the planets, and even the body itself as a whole. So it's much more complicated than we anticipated at first. It's not a machine. I think that metaphor is out of date, increasingly.
Comment over here. And say your name and who you're with as well, so we can.
Matt Myers, I work for EarthX, we're an environmental nonprofit. I was just thinking about what you were saying, it's how everything's kind of, we figure out the brain, we can game it so that we incentivize people to do things that will make others wealthy. I just wish that we could find a way to do that instead of incentivizing people or dragging people to do something to make other people wealthy, is to have people do something good, right? And take actions that have a positive impact. That's all that's going through my mind. So people want to go out and they want to have the next cryptocurrency so they can make a ton of money. And so people are going and meeting people, interacting with people with that end goal in mind. It's like, geez, what if I woke up in the morning like, how much good can I do today, and that's going to make me quote unquote wealthy. But is it wealth monetarily, or is it like something that we gain in a way that is struggleable, so you feel like you're wealthy or whatever at the end of the day? That's what's been going through my mind like the last 24 years.
I feel like that corner's got a lot.
I'm loving this flow conversation. I'm going to walk over here, and Grace will walk over here. One of the really interesting things that I've been seeing in Davos recently, and Grace, we're going to say something there, is this kind of polarity to Burning Man around the flow states, and you're seeing it here right now. So Burning Man is, if you live in a flow state for the week, and you just accept whatever comes along, and you're operating these kind of different intentions. But here at Davos, moments like this and conversations like this feel like that flow state, because we really don't have any idea what's going to happen next. And if you look at, we started on virtual state, and we're now talking about like basically drugging people and making them do what we want. And it's a very, very interesting thing about just how interconnected all of this actually really is. And my question to you is like, well, who's to say what is good? Because this is maybe the fundamental issue. We're all like working on these things, but the person who's actually experiencing it, maybe they should be the one that's actually figuring that out. The grace to this group.
So Zuck, I think
Unless you don't have any
Give us some prompts.
okay, prompts. Zuck, I think you have a lot to say about stateless, and if you're talking about virtual nations, what you've seen in displaced and the refugee populations, like on the ground. Bear, I think you've got a lot to say about, to answer this man's question about building good and impact into the currency and disrupting the banking model and just the strong accumulation of wealth just to have more full pockets. Reese, I think you could rock out pretty much anything under the sun, but I'd say, just what you've seen in technology and consciousness and how that applies to a conscious country maybe. Gino could riff on that as well.
So let's do it. Come on, guys.
All right. Hey, I'm Mike Zuckerman with TO.org. Primarily work with displaced populations, refugees in Greece, Uganda, and Bangladesh. And yeah, and I identify what you're saying about the digital divide. And I think this William Gibson quote that the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. I'm based in Palo Alto, but I spend a lot of my time in refugee camps. And this is obviously a huge challenge, and I think the technology that we need to figure out is these living systems, is the waste, water, energy, food, and really there's kind of multiple ways you look at it, but like right now, the refugee crisis that we saw coming to Europe, that was a couple million people. That's just the tip of the iceberg if we don't figure out these solutions, where these people are coming from, that they have opportunities, that they have a future, and yeah, I think that's one of the challenges that we're trying to figure out is how can a group of displaced people, whether that be 100,000 people, how can they live on their own self-sufficiently without needing to perpetually be part of the humanitarian industrial complex. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what we're doing. We're letting refugees build their own refugee camps. We're having refugees becoming the humanitarians themselves, not bringing humanitarian professionals from abroad. And yeah, so I think, technology is not necessarily going to be a solution. There are things like identity, which we're mentioning, but really just how do we figure out these systems for people to have what they need, and not just individually, but like collectively, like city scale.
Mike Zuckerman. My name is Garrett Kate. I'm going to talk about social good a little bit, incorporated into the business model. Co-founder of a challenger bank. It's called Good Money, and we're a banking platform. Really, the fundamental status quo, as we know, in one of the largest markets in the history of our species, banking. Current status quo, average consumer, $360 a year in fees to put your money in a bank where they make money on your money, funding extractive capitalism, and paying a very tiny percentage of that return in the form of nominal basis points, on your deposits. So, if we think about the direct-to-consumer wave that has disrupted industry by industry, it's become clear to us that retail banking is on deck. In Europe, you have things like Revolut and 26, Monzo, starting to really change that. In the US, there's very little that's happened yet. So we kind of had this crazy idea. We've been looking at the blockchain world, we've been looking at social good world, and the reality is that if we can't find a way to consumerize this into a form that the mass market millennial can vote with their feet, vote with their money, and take a real concrete action, then we're kind of wasting our time with white papers and theoretical ideas. And so, I think that's what I would sort of focus on in terms of, this notion of us trying to invent a new future. How do we actually do two things? One, make it relevant and consumerize it in a way where it's accessible, where it really hits a core need of a populist sentiment, which is very much teetering on the edge of very positive or very destructive. So if we can find ways to actually address things like social inequality, environmental destruction, racial injustice, and we can do that in a way that actually allows people to opt into participating into a better future, and then the creation from that actually aligns the incentives of the consumers. So what we're doing, our crazy idea, which is a very old idea, is to actually, for the first time in history, give away the equity in the bank to the user when they join. And so if we can build business models that actually do social good by incentivizing the customer with the company, our thesis is that the future, just like we saw the sharing economy come and disrupt the notion of how things are distributed, consumer companies, it makes sense that customers should own from the companies they buy from. And we think that in the future, consumers more and more will have the power to decide, I'm only going to actually buy from companies that align with my values, and that I actually get to own by virtue of supporting them. So if we can make a real statement here in banking inside the United States, and we can get tens of millions of people to actually open an account and become owners in this better future, then we can really move the needle. And I think to address your point, James, it's nice to give 1% away. That's great. We're being bold. We're giving 50% back to the user in all of our profits in perpetuity for the users to actually allocate towards impact. And obviously that's a big problem to solve. But the key is, I think, if we're actually funding and building successful businesses that really move the needle, how do we build those externalities into the business model in a way that's actually fundamental and transparent from the get-go, so that we can actually scale this new type of infrastructure and have it work in a way that's not reliant on a particular human ego to pilot us to that better future.
I have recently, one of the things that struck me about this year's Davos is the leadership of several different countries pulled out at the last minute and didn't show up. And especially those countries that seem to be drifting towards protectionism and isolationism. And the people who are remaining are a little bit more global and a little bit more private, separate from particular countries. And I wonder if this is a trend of the end of nation states' influence on the global conversation and more of an emergence of a globalist, less protectionist society, and that's where the conversation is drifting.
I'm Gino. I kind of made a couple comments earlier. I guess one of the things we're trying to bring to the table here is more of an Eastern perspective, and I think some of it has been alluded in that I think we're all here because we're concerned, and we have people from all, actually just in this room, many different countries and walks of life here. And with people like Stan putting things together to bring people together, from an Eastern perspective, there's a term, the outer reflects the inner, and world peace comes from inner peace. And as a radical kind of shift towards that, we've set up a place to continue this conversation, because I know we're kind of low on time, but we brought 20, and it looks like more emerging healers from all around the world, taking these deep wisdom traditions. We have a shaman from Colombia, we have a Taoist master from China, we have a Vaidya from Ayurvedic from India, and we have all these other people that have been looking at the healing arts. And this AI and all this other stuff have been looking at ideas, but I guess there's a shift now towards, without sounding too woo-woo, but the heart, can we look, or even the soul, if you want to go that far, and recognizing that we're all kind of on the same team, and it's really about, ultimately, it's about collectively supporting personal journeys. It doesn't really matter what country you're from, you exist and you're on a personal journey. And how do we collectively, doesn't matter where you're at, what you do, support those personal journeys. And the best thing you can do, I feel, to help that is to heal, to help understand who you are, why you're here, and what is this about. Now, the really great thing is people are looking at taking existing structures and what can we do within the existing mold to kind of shift things a little bit. Actually, before I go there, one of the big efforts that we're trying to do is really, I should stop talking?
Gary just says we want to hear about this project in Ghana.
Gary, can we shut the door over there, please?
Well, real quick, so the idea is to really look at entrepreneurship and organizational culture from the perspective of personal development. And look at new models. One of the things that we're riffing kind of an extension beyond that is looking at creating personal currencies that are backed by your last will and testament. So the idea is ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And to make transaction, rather than going from transactions to relational forms of engagement. And about investing in people rather than companies. And so really looking at frameworks, hey, there's a step, there's a leap. We're just gonna keep going all over the place. And we'll see what the universe allows to happen.
Thank you. Such a wide variety of inputs. Does anybody else have something you'd like to add? Can we go back to this back corner here? To David and you by the window, and then you go to David. And just for timekeeping, we have about 11 and a half minutes left. So we're very exact around here. It's Switzerland after all. And I'd love to spend the last 3 or 4 minutes to try to see if we can come up with a common definition for where we're going on this virtual state question. To you?
So it's funny, when I walked into this room, a partner and friend of mine, he's having a banking issue. He talking about banks. So I needed to pay for something in London. I paid for it. He sent me virtual currency. So by the time I was 5 minutes in, and I started hearing this conversation, I'm receiving Bitcoin in a Bitcoin wallet, and the whole thing's done, right? We're lowering the friction threshold, and I talked about Asia earlier, and kind of Eastern mentality in perception here. I just got back from an Asian country. As in excess of 100 million people, and one of the things that they really want to implement, I advise governments and family offices, is digital identity. Digital identity is so crucial, and it really comes down to underbanked and unbanked, and as you connect people, I think that's really the thesis that I see in all these conversations. We're lowering the friction threshold as you connect people, and that creates that peer-to-peer relationship and that ecosystem that we're seeing at the 1.0 level. Now going to a 2.0 level as the technology increases to allow for exponential expansion. And that's what interests me the most. And I keep hearing that as a theme here in this room.
David?
Cool. David Langer, founder of Lionheart Ventures. We're a new VC fund investing in solutions to existential risks. So in terms of the virtual states, I don't know what the definition is, but something that I would like to see included as a requirement for what we're building is accounting for externalities of our current model of capitalism. So things like the gases that we put into the air, the greenhouse gases, the plastic that we put into the oceans, and the other things. I think that nation states get a lot of blame at the moment. They're kind of the bad cop. But if we just build virtual states that don't account for the externalities, we might run into a lot of the same mistakes that nation states have run into. I think there's a lot of arrogance in the blockchain industry with people saying, oh, we're going to just put something on the blockchain and suddenly it's going to magically fix everything about the original industry without thinking it through. And I think that by far the biggest problem we have right now as a species is climate change and how we're treating the planet. And unless we start accounting for the externalities, whether it's within our current nation states, virtual states, or some kind of global state, we're not going to address the root cause of the issue.
I mean, I think a good sign that we're seeing, like we know the letters from Larry Fink, that he's urging the leaders of these Fortune 500 companies to be responsible about sustainability. And I work for these big evil companies. It feels like in the room we're trying to move away toward some of the traditional models. And I think these so-called big evil companies really are pushing toward these models, even if it's not from within, it's from the outside. And I think finally, especially when it's from the buy side, it's driving that forward. And so it's already, or at least in some of the companies where these black rocks are invested, it's already happening.
ESG, right? So
Exactly.
5 years ago, ESG didn't exist, and today it's pretty much,
It's a
you're a good
criteria for
company,
investing
it's a
now.
criteria.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here.
Hi, Yuri. I'm from Tel Aviv. I'm here with my company called Heidi. Just wanted to talk about digital identity for a second. I think that there is a balance here that needs to be kept between having the freedom and being able to actually share and collaborate around the world versus sort of like a Black Mirror sort of scenario where you lose your phone and then you can't prove that you exist. So I think that the balance here is very important, and looking at privacy and security of the data. If we go digital, how do you still maintain your own physical identity as a physical entity? I think that's a very important note to consider. I think another thing that you sort of, we spoke about it before, is that there's sort of a dissonance between our political state today and what we're talking about here. So if we look at our governments, and I come from a region where we see a lot of those things, it seems like we're going towards segregation more than cooperation. And I think that until this is resolved, there are major issues here that will be an obstacle.
Yeah, I think that there's a real danger in opting out. So when I talk to a lot of people, and younger people especially, I think many people feel very disenfranchised following the crash, especially, and then the widening gaps. And so the very people who could be potentially fixing the existing institutions are opting out. And this is one of the things that I think is really worth, kind of ending on, is like, there's all this talk about creating these new things and these new states, but there's maybe not enough talk, which is a very left concept about improving the state of the world through the existing institutions by improving and transforming and evolving the existing institutions, right? The existing institutions were built for a reason. And I think that's a really important question. Like, maybe a virtual state is just the next evolution and progression of the existing state. And maybe we should be thinking about how to help improve the existing system instead of like opting out to go create fantasy islands.
I think what this gentleman, and I think a lot of the conversation we're at World Economic Forum, we're talking about nations and states in this. The clarity that I got in the conversation last night with the burner was, if I'm born on a particular piece of land on this planet, and that defines me for the rest of my life, regardless of how I grow and change, or if I share the values of that community that is around me. I'm clearer now that it's more cyber tribes of global citizens than it is a nation or a state, probably going forward. And I would say that you go to shared experience, you go to shared values, which usually define nations or has in the past, and a movement towards actually a company purpose-built to solve for the SDGs. So that's what it exists for, not to protect its land or support its industry's growth in the world, but to get the job done. That changes things. And I'd say if it's moving more towards heart, we talked about the analog, the digital, and the head and the heart. A sonic tribe, an art tribe, I put Burning Man and a bunch of other cultures that are starting to emerge right now, and their global strength and continuity and purpose. It kind of looks like in their global distribution.
Yeah, and they're going to evolve, right?
Yeah,
they're going to
exactly.
evolve. Just to wrap up, a couple things to look at. Yesterday we announced a project that we've been working on for a year called Propel. It's about governance, and I spent last year sitting with like Native American tribes, with like the Raign strategist for like political strategy for the GOP. Like very interesting people from around the world looking and talking about governance. And the result of that is a system called Propel, which we launched into Hub Culture yesterday. And anyone can create hubs in Hub Culture that you can do different things with. But now you can add liquid democracy and liquid governance to any hub, and you can apply that towards any jurisdiction. And it has voting, and that voting can also be assigned to other people to help upweight experts. So I don't know a lot about neuroscience, but if there was a neuroscience policy within the system that was proposed, and I wanted to vote on it, I could give my vote to you, because I think that you know more about neuroscience than me, to make the best qualified potential answer. So my request would be, we have another session on Propel tomorrow in the morning, if you guys want to consider the evolution of this conversation into what digital liquid governance is potentially going to look like. That session will be here at 10 a.m. tomorrow. And look at Propel. If you have the Hub Culture app, or if you are a member of Hub Culture, which hopefully you all are, you can go into Hub Davos, and you can launch policies, principles, and planks related to the hub here in Davos. You can propose laws and rules for this particular geography, for Hub Culture at large, or for the Rohingya, any type of community or jurisdiction. And the idea here is to digitize governance and to make it shareable so that the best governance can be adopted according to the situations that need it or require it. So that's really the next evolution from what is a virtual state. To us, the question becomes, how do we build good governance, and how do we train our AI to be a great governance? And to that end, we also launched today Zeek2020.org. Zeek is our AI, and if you look at Zeek.ai, you can see how that artificial intelligence system is learning. And we're really looking at 2020 as being a market moment when an algorithm may be able to help influence the evolution of good governance. So look at Zeek2020.org and look at Propel inside of Hub Culture. Anything you can add to that before the conversation tomorrow will be actually part of that conversation. So this is kind of a living discussion. Meanwhile, we have to get ready for our next event, so thank you for coming. I don't think we got to the definition of an answer of a virtual state. Perhaps something came in online. If you have a definition from this conversation that somebody smart out there has distilled, I think we'd all love to see it. And you can watch and share this conversation from facebook.com/hubculture. please share it with your friends, and let's continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
I've been there. Oh, you have? Yeah, what's the name? Shadowman's name? Oh, Shadowman. Oh, you have? Yeah. That's what I want. Yeah. So I'm oh, you want that? Okay, cool. Yeah, that's oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, a lot of